Hi there and welcome back. I guess you're wondering what's the difference between containers and virtual machines, or VMs for short. In this video, I'm going to talk about virtual machines versus containers. Two powerful technologies that change the way we run and manage applications today. But before we dive into these differences, let's take a quick look at how things worked before these technologies were invented. In the past, companies would run just one application per physical server, meaning if you had a website, a database, and a DNS service, you needed three separate servers, one for each. Why? Because operating systems like Linux and Windows didn't do a great job of isolating multiple applications on the same server. Running everything together could cause conflicts and security risks. This wasted a lot of resources. Why? Because servers were too powerful. As a result of this, servers were not using their full potential. For example, if you bought a 10 gigabyte server capacity, you may end up using just 1 GB. So businesses were paying for unused power, and that wasn't efficient. To solve this problem, virtual machines were introduced. A virtual machine allows multiple applications to run on the same physical server by pretending each app has its own server. It does this using a piece of software called a hypervisor. Here is how it works. First, you will need a physical server. Then once you get a physical server, you will install an operating system on that physical server. That operating system will be known as the host operating system. Then you would install something called a hypervisor. So basically, a hypervisor is a software that makes it possible to create virtual machines, and it also allocates resources to these virtual machines. Then once you set up your hypervisor, you will then create your virtual machines. Now, if you see this, you're going to notice that each virtual machine will have its own operating system. So let's say you create the first virtual machine for your website, create the second virtual machine for your database, and you create the third virtual machine for your DNS service. So instead of buying 3 servers, you can use one server to run 3 virtual machines. This saved a lot of money and made better use of servers' power. But VMs had downsides. Each VM has a full operating system which takes up a lot of space. So as you can see, VM1 has its own operating system, VM2 has its own operating system, and VM3 has its own operating system. Let's say you had a server with a capacity of 10 GB of space. When you create the first virtual machine, you allocate 3 GB to that virtual machine and you're left with 7. When you create the second virtual machine, you allocate another 3 GB to that virtual machine and now you're left with 4. And on your third virtual machine, you allocate another 3 GB and now you're left with just 1 GB for your application. Another issue with virtual machines is that they consume a lot of memory and CPU. And finally, companies notice that virtual machines take a lot of time to start. Why? Because each virtual machine had its own operating system and had to boot differently. And also, if companies were running a licensed operating system like Windows, they had to buy a license for each virtual machine, which in the long run became expensive. Now, let's talk about containers, which were designed to be faster and more efficient than virtual machines. A container is simply an application package with everything it needs to run, like code, libraries, runtime, and dependencies. That means you can run it anywhere without worrying about missing files and configuration issues. Here's how containers are different from virtual machines. The first thing is that containers don't need their own full operating system. Instead, they share the host operating system. Containers are also lighter, faster, and more portable than VMs. Here's how containers can be created. First, you're going to need a physical server. Then once you get your physical server, you will install an operating system, also known as the host operating system. It can either be Windows or Linux. Once you get your operating system set up, you then install something called a container runtime. So you're going to notice that in the case of virtual machines, you install something called a hypervisor, but in the case of containers, you install something called a container runtime. And once you have your container runtime up and running, you then create different containers that will host different applications. For example, this first container can host your website, the second one will host your database, and the third one will run your DNS service. The first thing I want you to notice is that virtual machines do have their own operating system, but in the case of containers, they do not have an operating system. Why? Because they share the host operating system. And because they share the host operating system, they are lightweight compared to virtual machines, they are faster to start compared to virtual machines, and they are extremely portable compared to virtual machines. They also start instantly and they consume consume less CPU and memory compared to virtual machines. Both virtual machines and containers are useful. Some companies use both together, running containers inside of VMs for extra control. But if you care about speed, portability, and efficient use of resources, containers are the clear winner. And that's why tools like Docker are so popular today. And the beauty is that you don't need your own physical server to run containers. With the cloud, you can simply provision virtual machines in the cloud like this and run your containers inside of these virtual machines. Thank you for watching this video. In my next video, we will explore how Docker makes working with containers even easier, and see you in my next video. Bye.